from management. Welcome. We're going to get started now with our opening introduction and our keynote address. And the way it works will follow the agenda. And you'll see that there are a few different spots for discussion. And so that can be both discussion in this room, but also with our webinar team. So the goal is to really stimulate a lot of interesting thoughts and discussion. And then at the end of the day, we'll wrap up and think about where do we go. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Emily Martini, who is the Managing Director of the Mid-Atlantic District of Sustainability UTC, going to introduce the UTC and then our speaker.
Okay, so good morning, everybody. Thank you for getting here, and thank you to all of our webinar participants. I'm hoping that they can hear me. I'm trying to negotiate with them on whether they're hearing us. I'll be just sitting down here in the front, but I am very excited that we're having this event, and I think it's great to line up the speakers that Elise has gotten us. The Mid-Atlantic Transportation Sustainability University Transportation Center started in, I guess, the beginning of August last year. We are the Region 3 University Transportation Center, so each region has a center. We needed to follow one of the US DOT strategic goals, so ours is environmental sustainability. So I think part of it, part of our outreach and all is to, help us all understand what do we mean by sustainability, what's going on, what are the things, and so this symposium is really trying to get us to be thinking about sustainability and to really introduce quite a few topics. I'm excited about all of our speakers here today. I'm hoping that it works, that you have the dialogue in the room, that we have people joining us online, and really having some information there that we can then have available to people, the presentation, the recording of the webinar, recording of the video here that we can share with people going forward. So does anybody have any questions before we get started? Everything? This is the mics are not live unless you press the button and it turns red. And if there's a limit of 4 red mics in the room or something. So if more people than that want to speak, then they all go crazy. So, but there should not be a mic in front of you yet. And I will definitely try to find out from the webinar folks whether they can hear what's going on. I do want to introduce Joe Beachman. He's the head of the Environment and Air Quality Division at Texas A&M Transportation Institute. So it is PhD from Texas A&M, graduate, member of the graduate faculty of Texas A&M. But the big deal is that he has a lot of research in sustainable transportation, air quality, climate change, and performance measurement. He's also an active member of DRB. He chairs the Committee on Transportation and Sustainability and serves as the research subcommittee chair of the Air Quality Committee. So I think this is a great way to start us off today. Thank you very, very much, Joe.
Thank you very much, everybody, and it's a great honor for me to be here today and kick this meeting off. The topic of my discussion is sustainability, state of the practice, measuring and monitoring, and I think the important part of what I will be talking about is actually the second part of that, the measuring and monitoring, because so much is being said about sustainability and people like to talk about it, but when it comes to actually implementing and making a difference, it all comes down to measuring, monitoring, and actually applying sustainability. So I'll give you some hints and some ideas of how we can move forward and take this debate a little bit further and actually getting it more to implementation. A little bit more background about myself, not that I want to say too much about myself, but I think it might be relevant in the UTC context, and that is that I'm originally from South Africa. You could probably tell from my accent I'm not really from the US. I've been here for a long time, but I still haven't figured out the Texas accent. But so I grew up there and did my bachelor's and master's degrees there and worked there professionally for a few years, and then had the opportunity to come to the US to do a PhD, and went to Texas A&M. This was the spring of '98, so this is a long time ago, and I wasn't exactly sure what I was going to do my work on, and public-private partnerships was a hot topic for South Africa, and my sponsor actually wanted me to pursue that. And towards the end of the first semester, my advisor, Dr. Larry Rylett, whom many of you know, pulled me aside and said, he just got this UTC project on sustainable transportation. Firstly, would I like to do the project, and secondly, make that the focus of my PhD work? And I said, well, my first question to him was, what is sustainable transportation? And Larry looked at me and he said he doesn't know really, but maybe I should do a PhD on the topic and we will both know what it is afterwards. Anyway, so I went and had a look, and in '98, in the spring, that's a long time ago, as I said, I couldn't find much on the topic. I think if I probably printed out all the literature, which I did after a while, it's about that high. It's about 1.5 feet, so it's not that. Anyway, it was interesting enough that I decided this is what I probably want to pursue, and I told Dr. Ayelet, let's go for it. And I'm very, very grateful to the UTC program for basically funding my PhD work. I finished in 2000, and I think it really launched my career into this whole area of environmental sustainability, air quality, etc. So when Elisa asked me if I'm prepared to come speak here, I said absolutely. It's a great honor, and I'm really happy to be here and talk about this topic, which started out a long time ago. So what I want to cover in my presentation, the outline is basically, I want to start with an overview, maybe a big picture, a really high-level view of where things are heading. Secondly, I want to talk about what is sustainability and sustainable transportation, and maybe an easier way to tackle that is what it's not. There's a lot of conceptual ideas, and a lot of people think about it in a certain way, a lot of myths, and let's start with that and talk about what it's not, and that might be a simpler way to address it as opposed to what it is. Thirdly, I want to talk about measurements, bringing it back, making this concept or this vision come to life. So we want to do that through measurement, and I looked at the agenda for the rest of the day, and I'm excited about what this symposium is actually doing. What it does is we're getting into all the different rating tools and decision-making things and so many applications that's going to be talked about. So it's so relevant in terms of making sustainability come to life. So this is a great symposium. It's unfortunate that I have to go to the conference that my committee is doing today and tomorrow and on Friday, so I would have loved to stay, but I think it's an excellent time, an excellent topic. So that's the measurement issue. Number 4, I want to share with you some research needs, research ideas that through my work the past 5 years as chair of the Sustainability Committee, we've been looking at it and identifying research needs, and TRB is all about research. So I would like to share with you a few ideas that we think are relevant and that we probably want to address, and then I'll conclude. So coming firstly with the overview, basically, transportation and where is it? So we're talking about transportation and environmental sustainability, and specifically in the area of transportation. So if we look globally at transportation as a sector, it's a third of the problem. So transportation is huge in terms of its impact on the environment and in other aspects. So in terms of pollutant emissions on the air quality side, transportation is a third of the problem. Energy consumption, transportation is a third. Greenhouse gases, it's a third. So it's a huge, huge deal. And if we project forward, if we're looking into the future, where is it heading? Is it going to get less of an impact or more? And the feeling is transportation is going to stay critically important. If we just look at an issue like car ownership, for example, globally, we see that there's 850 million vehicles on planet Earth, and if you park them end to end, they circle the Earth 100 times. So there are lots of vehicles. Is that going to get less, or people are inclined to get more vehicles and drive more? We can almost look at personal mobility as a basic human need. As soon as people start getting money in their pockets in developing countries, people that don't have vehicles yet, that's kind of where they want to head. So they want to start getting mobile and be able to drive. So the United States is very mature when it comes to car ownership. 800 vehicles per 1,000 population, so it's probably settled, it's probably stable. But if you look at some of these emerging economies like China and India with more than 1 billion people in population, where are they heading? China is just over 100 vehicles per 1,000 population. India is probably heading towards 15 only. So there's this huge latent demand of people wanting to own vehicles and drive them. We'll come back to that point, but I think we're not going to see a huge reduction in vehicle emissions and energy use. The second point there, I wanted to highlight a conference that happened 2-3 years ago, the Rio Plus 20 conference. So 20 years before that, in 1992, the big Earth Summit took place in Rio de Janeiro in 1992, basically kicked off sustainable development organized by the United Nations. 20 years later, they went back to Rio, and that conference basically put the blueprint for sustainable development out there. 20 years later, they went back to Rio de Janeiro, and the reason why I want to highlight that is, firstly, it was a huge, huge event. We are used to TRB attracting 12,000 people, and we know that that's a lot of people. At that conference, the attendance was 45,000 on sustainable development. Gives you a perception of how important that topic is. So 45,000 people went to Rio de Janeiro to talk about sustainable development, and 130 heads of state were represented there, just giving you an idea of the importance. And what happened was, under sustainable development, they ranked the different areas or sectors in terms of importance so that the multilateral development banks can put money towards addressing some of these topics. The topic that came out first and got the most money is sustainable transportation. So that's under sustainable development. Transportation was ranked number 1. $175 billion was pledged by these multilateral development banks to pursue sustainable transportation. And granted, it's not all new money, but just the emphasis and a lot of projects got refocused in terms of addressing sustainable transportation. So that was a huge deal. And it just shows us how important transportation is when it comes to sustainability. The third bullet there talks about the post-2015 development agenda. So that's where we're now. So what is the UN doing currently in terms of sustainable development? So post this big conference in Rio, where transportation was kind of highlighted as a key topic, they are now working on the development agenda. And I looked at the draft not too long ago, what sort of sustainable development goals they're coming up with. My first glance on that draft was a little bit of a shock, because I thought transportation would be the first goal and everybody would be happy and we move forward. I didn't see transportation being mentioned. So that was a shock, and then I took a step back and looked at it a little bit more carefully. So I think what's going on, and I think that's actually a good trend, transportation is actually within all the goals. So it actually is making its way to within all the goals, and I think that is where it belongs. So if you start isolating transportation, you probably run into some risks of just looking at it in a vacuum or in a silo. And transportation is much broader than that. It's almost like the veins and the blood of the organism. So it goes much beyond just looking at transportation. So it's not a bad trend. I think it's all exciting where it's going. The next slide, just I want to confirm some of these trends. My group is doing some work for ExxonMobil, and they shared this slide with us in terms of a future energy outlook. So these oil companies do a real fantastic job in looking at the future and what energy consumption would be. And if you look at this slide, the y-axis talks about MBDOE. Many of you know what that stands for. It's million barrels per day oil equivalent. So that's the amount of oil consumed by transportation moving forward, starting at 2000 and projecting to 2040. What you see there is the line is linear and it's going up, up. So I'm sure if I was an executive at ExxonMobil and I look at this graph, I don't have too much to worry about. Life looks good. Oil is being consumed. And those numbers that I quoted earlier about vehicles and things like that, still 95% of all energy consumed by vehicles are still fuel-based, oil-based. So that's the challenge. So on that trend, the two things I just want to quickly point out is the light duty seems to flatten out. And I think that is, even though there will be more light-duty vehicles driving around and more vehicle miles of travel, I think the trend is that vehicles are really cleaning up. It's getting, fleets are being replaced, newer vehicles are coming in, and the fuel efficiency is improving. So that's probably why light duty is flattening out. But on the heavy duty side, I think the challenge is huge. You can see that that is just increasing significantly going into the future. So that's one of the challenges we're going to face, is on the heavy duty vehicle side, basically big trucks. The demand for moving goods is going to stay, and a lot of that is still being moved by truck. And there's a big challenge right there. Transportation and the environment. Obviously, just to mention again the big areas, and a lot of those will be addressed at this symposium, and climate change, air quality, water quality, noise, soil quality, biodiversity, and land take. So those are the big issues when we look at transportation and the environment. The first four are probably the biggest ones, the ones that we have most concern about. And I think some of them are probably underestimated, like, for example, air quality. The World Health Organization always looks at data in terms of deaths caused by different factors. And they went and looked at their 2012 data again and found out that the previous estimates were off by a huge factor. In fact, they estimated half, and the actual numbers are more like double what they initially estimated, deaths due to air quality. The revised numbers is more like 7 million a year deaths due to poor air quality, as opposed to the 3.5 million that they thought initially. So that makes air quality the largest environmental health risk at the moment. And that's not something we typically think when we hear in the United States. But mega cities like Delhi, Beijing, etc., they are all focusing on air quality, having that as their number one issue. So this whole issue of transportation and the environment is critical. And it's exciting that UTC, and especially this UTC, is focusing on sustainable transportation and environmental sustainability. Now I want to talk about what it is, what is sustainable development, sustainable transportation, and or what are these so-called myths that I talked about. As I hinted in the late 90s, I did my doctoral work on sustainable development, sustainable transportation, and performance measures. I learned a lot during that process. But I learned even more when I started doing some projects on the topic. A couple of national and international projects, as well as NCHRP 708, where we developed a guidebook on sustainable transportation. Learned a lot through that process, but when I learned the most is this process that we've just finished now, and that is to write a book with a bunch of academics. If you really want to take a step back and think about stuff that you don't think you would think about, try and write a book with a few academics. It might drive you crazy along the way. You start out as great friends, and at the end, you're still friends, but you think of each other a little bit differently. So that's just the warning I want to give you. We started, when we were working on NCHRP 708, I had a couple of international experts on the group with me. I just absolutely needed some more brain power on that project. So I invited Dr. Hendrik Gudmundsen of Technical University of Denmark, Ralph Hall of Virginia Tech, and Greg Marston of Leeds University to join the team at the time. This was 5, 6 years ago. So we had a lot of fun working on NCHRP. It's so much fun that we said one year at TRB, let's write a book. Okay, and it sounded like a great idea at the time, so we said, yes, let's write a book. So we started 5 years ago, and I'm very happy to tell you that the book is now at the publishers. I don't think we have to do much more to it. It's being finally tweaked, and it's going to get published in a month or so. So we're very excited, and we learned a lot through the process, and we had a couple of retreats, because that's the way when you really sit down and think about stuff. And that picture at the bottom is actually in North Yorkshire in England, so close to Leeds University, not too far away, and Greg hosted us there. That's an old watermill. And if you really want to think deeply about issues, go with a couple of academics and for a week just in the middle of nowhere and talk about sustainable transportation. So again, that's where we learned a lot, and we had a lot of philosophical discussions. It was a great time. So what did we learn? So in terms of the myths, what are these so-called myths, and what are the things that people tend to believe that are not necessarily true? The first thing that I hear when we get into DOTs and NPOs and start talking about sustainability and sustainable transportation, they tell us, well, we've always been doing it. So what you're talking about is actually not new. We've been doing it for a very long time. I'll grant it to them that aspect of sustainability has been done for a long time, but the true strong sustainability, where you look at the different dimensions in an integrated way now and into the future, and you also tend to start looking beyond transportation, that is very new, and there are not that many examples of that as being done a long time ago. That is the new element of sustainability. So I don't agree that it's always been done. I think a lot of good work has been done over the years, and there's a great focus now on doing it the more comprehensive way. Second one that I often hear is it cannot be defined, and I think you've all heard that one. Well, it's this fuzzy concept. Let's not worry about it. It's just something green, something good that we have to do. Again, I don't agree with that, although with our NCHRP project, the first task or the second task, I think it was actually the first one, come up with a definition for sustainable transportation. So I remember even winning the project was very, very competitive, and I was very happy that my team was selected. And then we had our first panel meeting, the panel discussion, and it was on the phone, and they said, okay, so how's it coming up with your definition for sustainable transportation? And I remember I had to tell the panel that we're not coming up with a definition for sustainable transportation, sorry, but we will come up with principles for sustainability and sustainable transportation. And so that any agency and any group can come up with their own definition as long as they adhere to the principles. So fortunately, they bought that, and we were not forced to come up with a definition, because if you come up with a definition, you always run into the issue that, well, in my context, this definition doesn't fit, and I'm not happy with it, and people get frustrated. But if you're true to the principles of sustainability, you can actually come up with your own definition that fits your context, your agency, your area, however you want to look at it. So even in this guidebook that we did, the NCHRP 708, we came up with the principles that's kind of illustrated with that three-legged stool. And we came up with guidance on how to define sustainability and sustainable transportation for your context. So there are specific steps. So no, I think that is a myth. Sustainability and sustainable transportation can be defined, provided you contextualize it for your own context and for your own area. So the principles, I don't need to say much about that. I think we all know about that. It's basically looking at the three dimensions, the social, economic, and environment, meeting the needs now and into the future. And the area of equity, we like to address within each dimension. Often they pull out equity and put it into the social dimension, but that's a bit of a risk. You want to address equity in all your dimensions, because otherwise you just worry about equity when it's all about social. But if you want to address the environment, you need to think about equity very, very seriously. So that is how we laid it out in our guidebook. Third one, sustainability can be reached in a reasonable time frame. And this is a bit of a shocker to many of us, that people say, well, yes, my agency has now evolved, and we have now reached sustainability in terms of our practices. Well, I like that chuckle, and I think I agree with you, and I know what you're thinking. It is actually an end goal that you're trying to reach, and we have trajectories towards sustainability. But to actually arrive and reach it, I think that's going to be not in my lifetime, probably not in my kid's lifetime. So it's going to be a while before we say, wow, we brought this planet to a place where we are now sustainable and things are going to be great. So this challenge is going to be there for a long time. So again, we can evolve from a very weak approach to sustainability, where we're looking at compromises between the different dimensions, we're addressing one element. We can evolve to a very strong approach where we're doing it all in an integrated way. But to say that we actually will achieve it, that is going to be hard. And what about sustainable transportation? I might want to say something about that specifically. When we look at transportation in itself, can it even be made sustainable? That's very hard, because we're talking about all these negative externalities, congestion, air quality, accidents, all those things. How can you actually get to a state where you've got zero accidents, zero emissions, where it's totally sustainable? Maybe that's possible in a future lifetime. But the frustration always comes into a sustainable transportation when you try to make it sustainable and try to reach that goal. I think a better way to look at it is transportation's role in sustainability. If you look at it a little bit broader than just transportation, you find out that your contributions have broader impact, and you also feel that you're actually helping the other sectors, and we can look at it a bit broader, and we reach sustainability a little bit quicker and a little bit better. Even though true sustainability will not be reached, but it's a good goal to have, and we should make efforts towards it. issue about money. A lot of people say, well, we're already so strapped for cash, and now we talk about sustainability. How can we incorporate that also? We're already trying to just get stuff maintained and projects implemented. Sustainability is just another burden that we don't want to deal with. Well, my take on that, it is not a money-losing endeavor. Firstly, and we need to get this out of the way, it is the right thing to do. Your social responsibility is to look after your planet and to leave something behind that's better than you got it, if that's at all possible. So firstly, that's that. And I don't think that's really negotiable. That's your social responsibility. The second element is if you pursue sustainability and sustainable transportation as a company, as an organization, as an MPO, I think there's very good PR, public relations elements to that. People would like to get re-elected, that's the one thing, and if the public thinks you're doing a good job, that's not a bad thing, you'll probably get re-elected in public office again. If you're a private sector company and people think that you're doing something good for the environment and for society, they probably will give you more work just based on that. As if everything else is equal, I'd rather give money to a company that's doing something in a sustainable way. And thirdly, if you delve deep into this issue of sustainability, is it really costing us more money? If you start recycling, you start to think about, do you really have to make this trip? Can you do it in a little bit better way? Can you idle less? Can you use more fuel-efficient vehicles? If you start going through that approach, you might end up, and you probably will end up saving a lot of money. So all in all, this story about a money-losing endeavor, I don't believe that, and I think there are many ways that sustainability can actually save you money and actually bring you money in this whole process. The fifth one and the final one is the concept will disappear. And as I said, I started my work on this topic in '98. And whenever I presented these things at conferences, etc., I often have people in the audience say, well, this sustainability stuff you're talking about is very interesting, but it's like a flavor of the month. It will probably go away in a couple of months or a year or so. It's just something that's very cute and very interesting right now. Well, I have to say that it's really grown exponentially in terms of interest and importance since that time. And it probably will also. The only problem with it might be the actual word sustainability. There's a context, if you think about what it means to sustain something into the future. It could also mean to sustain something that's not that great into the future. So the term is not perfect. Nobody's really come up with something better, but we know what it means, and that is kind of back to those principles. So the concept will not disappear. I can assure you of that. This whole notion of looking after the future generations and taking care of the earth is very important. It will not go away. The term might get tweaked or changed, so that is something that we could see. So those are the myths, and that helped a little bit explaining what the perception of sustainability and sustainable transportation is. Now I want to quickly talk about how do we bring it to life? How do we measure? How do we actually apply it? And a lot of what's being talked about, the rating systems and other things, is, after I speak, is really relevant to this issue. And that is what's so exciting about this UTC, and that is that they really get down to the implementation side of sustainability. Again, the guidebook we prepared there, NCHRP 708, is a good framework. It's a good guidance for how to measure and what to measure. When it comes to measurement, a temptation is just to measure because, just pick a few performance measures, start quantifying them and just tracking them. So it's almost measuring for the sake of measurement, and that's a dangerous place to be. In my previous job in South Africa, we collected performance measures for the large MPO that I worked, and one day I asked the DOT that we did it for, why do we measure these things? And they couldn't give us a good answer. So this whole issue of measuring for the sake of measurement is dangerous. What we start out with, or should start out with, is a framework. And I've got two illustrations on the left of a framework, what a framework is and what it should do for us. The first one is this picture frame. It focuses your attention. So if you see a picture frame somewhere, you're going to look what's inside that frame. Your attention is drawn to that. My wife is an art teacher, so picture frames is something we see all over the house, all over the place. So I got educated to look inside those frames very, very often, very carefully. The second part of the framework is kind of that frame of that house that's being framed. What that framework is telling us is it's going to be a house. We have some structure to it. It might be a double-story house. We have no idea what the finishes are going to be. I have no idea what the color is going to be, what it's going to look inside, but we know it's going to be a house. So a framework is important to focus you and to kind of give you structure in terms of what you need and what's going to happen. So when it comes to measuring sustainability or bringing it to life or implementing it, measurement and performance measures are very, very key. In the NCHRP 708 guidebook, we have this framework. Basically a couple steps, very simple, 4 steps. And without getting into too much detail, the first step is basically understanding. So we need to all be on the same frame, same picture in terms of what sustainable transportation is. That basically ties back to what I talked about, the principles and the definition and things like that. So it's a very important step. If you want to apply sustainability in an agency, in a company, you need to start there. Let's get everybody on the same page. And often that requires top management. I just came back from Namibia working with their roads authority, and that's what we did. I basically said we need the top management in the room for a day and to get to that level. And that's what it took, and it works. The second part is the goals. The goals are tied to the needs. Obviously, every organization, every agency, they all have needs. So once you know your needs, you can come up with goals, but not any goals. If you want to address sustainability, these goals need to be sustainability goals. They need to tie back to the principles of sustainability. So that is very important. So your goals tie back to the principles and you want to address needs. Thirdly, we have objectives. And that almost sounds like, why do we really need objectives? Well, goals are basically too broad. You come up with these broad goals that you want to address, but to jump from those broad goals to measuring and applying, that's a big leap. So we need these objectives or sub-goals to actually help us into a more detailed level. So for example, let's say the goal is improve air quality. That's a very broad term and a very broad concept. What measures, what do we do? How do we look at improving air quality? Maybe the objective could be reduce on-road mobile sources. So now we focus, now we know what we're trying to do. The final step is performance measures. So again, we're not measuring just for the sake of measuring. These performance measures need to be tied to the objectives. So if you have an objective, it's not that difficult to come up with a measure. But before you're not only coming up with a measure just to be able to measure, you need to know the purpose. Why do we need this measure? What are we going to accomplish with it? So the type of things that you could need it for is just to communicate. You just want to show some trends. I just want to see what things are. You can use performance measures to do some evaluation and some comparisons. You can use performance measures to do some decision making. All those kind of applications you need to think about before you select your measures, and they need to be tied to the objectives. Just before I close, I want to talk about some potential research areas. And based on what I said in the beginning, I might want to add one, just thinking about it. And this is this whole area of heavy-duty vehicles. I showed that trend that ExxonMobil gave us. So I think this whole area of trucks and getting those things to be more fuel efficient and less polluting and less, maybe this whole area of freight per se, I think that's an area that I think we should address. So I just want to put that out there. I didn't put it on the slide, but as I was speaking to you guys, I just thought about this whole area of freight, heavy-duty vehicles we should address. The social dimension, when I showed you that stool, it's almost, if I have to draw it accurately, one of those legs are a little bit shorter or a little bit weaker than the other ones, and that's the social one. And a lot of that has probably got to do with the fact that we're mostly engineers, we work engineering stuff, and we're very light and very weak on the social side. Just other folks might have better ideas. I don't want to try and debate what I think we could do. On one of my projects, I actually have a psychologist working with me on topics, and that's helping broadening our vision a little bit. Secondly, climate change, this whole issue of resilient infrastructure, and I think that's going to be addressed also in the symposium, which is perfect. Alternative energy, that ExxonMobil graph, again, is just linearly going upwards, 95% of all transportation being fueled by petroleum fuel. Not a good trend. Something has to be done. it almost makes me think of the issue that I've heard one person say one day, and that kind of stuck with me, is we were able to get out of the Stone Age before we ran out of stones. Let's hope with the oil age, we can get out of the oil age before we run out of oil. So let's hold our thumbs that can happen. Transportation and health, that is coming up a lot. And the nice trend that I'm seeing there is transportation officials working with health professionals. And that is kind of an eye-opening experience, because you begin to see, why do we really care about these things? Because, yeah, people get sick, and they get sick in this way, and if we do this, this could help. So it really opens up a whole spectrum. So transportation and health. Autonomous and connected vehicles. Not sure when that's going to happen, but it is there. People are looking at it. People are beginning to do some platooning, and there's some things happening on that score. And I think we, from a sustainability perspective, have to keep track on that and see what we can say about it. And finally, decision making. So again, all these tools and techniques and rating systems, they are all fitting in beautifully with decision making tools and better decisions. Now, I think it's very important. And that's the job of UTC and others, to come up with better methodologies and better decision-making methods. And I think that is the end, and I'll, just in conclusion, just a few wrap-up things. The concept is here to stay, no doubt, and I think we've agreed to that. Sometimes I have to mention that the process is just as important as the product. When we're dealing with broad issues like sustainability and getting beyond transportation, let's make sure that the process is pristine and sound. We get the right people involved, and the process is very, very important. Don't just measure for the sake of measurement. Use a framework. And the framework I put forward is not the only framework. That is just a broad framework articulated in NCHRP 708. But depending on your application, your context, use a framework. And these many research areas, I think there are challenges, and we should definitely set ourselves up that we start pursuing those and see what we can do. Thank you very much for your time. And I wish you all well with the symposium, and I really appreciate the opportunity. I can, thanks.
You go ahead and use your microphone.
I think it's on now.
Yeah.
My name is Robert DiDomenico, and I focus on freight, specifically urban freight, but not so much aggregated freight in heavy vehicles. I focus on the very inefficient freight of using a personal vehicle to pick up a prescription, a pack of cigarettes, a loaf of bread, or perhaps a gallon of milk, that comes to a consumption rate of 1 million BTUs per ton mile or more. And I think there's a lot of room in a research area for that. And if you'd like, I could fill you in more on it later. So not so much a question, sorry.
No, thanks for that comment. Incidentally, the one co-author on the book, Dr. Ralph Hall, is the research subcommittee chair of our committee. And if you shoot me an email with some thoughts, I think this would be a topic that we could look into under the Sustainability Committee.
I do not have any questions online. And we use the mic so it's here. Okay, so now hopefully they can hear me. But so yeah, there's no questions right now, but I think this was great. Maybe we can go to our second speaker.
And then we can have some discussion at the end of the three. So while Connie is getting mic'd up, I'll introduce her. Connie Hill is an environmental protection specialist on the Sustainable Transport and Climate Change team in FHWA's Office of Natural Environment in Washington, D.C. Connie works on policy matters research on program initiatives related to sustainability, including the development of a sustainable highway grading tool, INVEST. Since there are 15 years experience with FSWA. We also provide policy and technical assistance on brownfields, hazardous waste sites, and other issues related to contamination citations, state DOTs, local planning organizations, and others. Connie holds a PhD in Urban and Environmental Studies from Lawrenceburg Polytechnic Institute, a Master of Science in Geology, also from RPI, and a Bachelor of Science in Geology from Virginia State University. And as we get her slides pulled up, Connie will be sharing some examples and the framework that was used to develop through that.
Sorry, do you know how to make it, how do you make this so presenter view?
All right.
Well, while Elise is working on that, I just want to say how glad I am to be here this morning and have the chance to talk about INVEST. And I'm kind of glad also I'm following Joe because I can kind of support some of the things he said this morning about sustainable transportation and those things that we at FHWA considered when we developed the INVEST tool. And so this morning I'm planning to talk about the tool and give a little bit of background about the tool itself, but mostly I want to share what we've learned from some of the states that have actually started using the tool. Not being sure about how much detail to go into in terms of background. I do have some background slides on what is sustainability and what is sustainable transportation, and talk a bit about how we created the tool, why and how we created the tool at FHWA, and then get into a little bit about what some of the states have done with the tool. So this is what the presentation will, the order of things will follow this morning. Again, I plan to share what we think sustainability is at the Federal Highway Administration and what sustainable transportation is. We'll talk a bit about how the sustainable transportation, how sustainability and sustainable transportation are supported at the Federal Highway Administration through our Sustainable Highways Initiative. I'll share with you again some things about the INVEST tool and how we've been using it, and then a little bit about some resources that we have for using the INVEST tool, where we are with research with regards to sustainability and sustainable transportation practices, and some things that we foresee in the near future. So I thought a bit that I would be kind of preaching to the choir a bit by starting off with this discussion about what is sustainability, but I'm kind of glad I included that now, especially following Joe's presentation. Sustainability means different things to different people. And so when we started off or embarked at Federal Highway about and even creating a team that focuses on sustainability, I'm on the Sustainable Transport and Climate Change team that was started or formed in 2008. So even for us, this is a fairly new initiative. We didn't really have what we call our own definition of sustainability. We relied on the standard Brundtland Commission definition of sustainability, which focuses on the triple bottom line elements of sustainability: the environmental, the economic, and the social aspects of sustainability. And like most of you here in the room and in the web room have heard, we think about sustainability as meeting present-day needs, but assuring that we are also capable of continuing to meet those needs well into the future. And so when we were set about the task of creating a tool to measure this thing called sustainability, we had to figure out what it was as far as we're concerned, but also because we are a transportation agency, we honed in on specifically what is a sustainable highway system or what is sustainable transportation. So we think of the Federal Highway Administration pretty much views sustainability as the sort of meeting the future. We think of, first of all, of a sustainable transportation as being an integral part of sustainable development. I think Joe mentioned that as well, that if you think about the overall concept of sustainable development, transportation is one piece of that, and it's one critical piece of that. So we at the FHWA, we think about sustainable highways as an integral part of sustainable development, and think that we created some characteristics of a sustainable highway, if you will. A sustainable highway is one that satisfies basic functional needs. That is, it meets the goals and needs of a community with regards to moving people, with regards to moving goods, and also with regards to protecting the area in which that particular transportation system or highway serves. The sustainability of a highway should be assessed and considered all the way from the beginning through the end, from the ideas of the conception stage all the way through the design, the planning design, construction, operation, and maintenance. So we think of a sustainable highway as being one that meets those critical needs all the way through its entire life cycle. It avoids or minimizes or at least reduces the impacts of that particular highway or transportation structure on the environment, and it reduces the level of consumption of resources. Having satisfied ourselves that we have something to work with in terms of a base for moving forward with a sustainable, creating a tool like INVEST, we thought about what is it, or how is sustainability supported at the FHWA. We deliver through our federal aid highway program and our federal lands program the services and the resources, technical, financial, and other resources that states and MPOs need to provide transportation for the general public. And so we wanted to set as a goal to deliver those programs in a much more sustainable way, making sure that we are mindful of the resources that we have to work with, that we are mindful of the resources in which we have to work, i.e. the environment, and mindful of the people that we actually serve. At the FHWA, we aim to make better investment decisions with those limited resources. We try to encourage within the professional practice among transportation professionals the use or application of sustainable practices, helping to identify what those are and encouraging them to use them. We try to take advantage of any opportunity that we can to include sustainability throughout the decision-making process. I think Joe talked about decision-making as he gave his presentation, that it's important to incorporate sustainable transportation ideas and considerations throughout the process of decision-making, and figure out how we can use sustainability to make better decisions or to make better choices with transportation. We think of sustainability at FHWA is going beyond compliance, doing things that you do, the things that we have to do or that states and MPOs have to do because that's the law. Congress requires it, the government requires it, the law requires it, states require certain things, federal agencies and other agencies require certain things. So those things you're going to do anyway. We think of sustainability as being achieved when you go beyond what's actually required. So we talk often about going above and beyond what's necessary, going beyond compliance, and seeking a balance among the different solutions that you actually arrive at in trying to meet the transportation and other goals of a community. We try to stress implementation of sustainable practices so that we're not just talking the talk. We want to talk the talk and walk the walk. We want to take those sustainable ideas and move them into action, actually have some things for people to do. When states say, well, we don't know what it means to be sustainable, what we're trying to do within our program is to identify things that can be done and encourage them to actually move in that direction. So we have at the Federal Highway Administration now a Sustainable Highways Initiative. We kind of work backwards in our agency, actually, because one of the first things we did when we when the Sustainable Transport and Climate Change team, our first major task was to create the INVEST tool. It wasn't even called the INVEST tool then. It was like create a tool that's kind of like LEADS that states and MPOs can use to help them evaluate, quantify, if you will, how sustainable their transportation practices and projects are, to identify what they can do to make their transportation practices and projects and plans more sustainable and help them get there. So we started off doing that, and that became a huge endeavor. And then as we were doing it, we realized that, we don't really have a framework, Joe, in which to really house that particular tool. And so later we created a sort of the framework, if you will, the umbrella, if you will, that we refer to now as the Sustainable Highways Initiative. And that initiative supports programs and activities throughout the Federal Highway Administration that helps to facilitate the balanced decision-making among the different triple bottom line elements that I just spoke about. And the Sustainable Highways Initiative serves not only our particular immediate program area, but all of those across the agency. And so it considers access, not just mobility. It considers movement of people as well as goods, not just the movement of vehicles. It considers, it provides, it attempts to assist with helping people make or have transportation choices, such as safe and comfortable routes for walking and biking and having transit options. It promotes the efficient use of funding, incentives for construction. It promotes improvements in air quality and regional air quality and climate change. And it also promotes or encourages using environmental management systems as well as other considerations in providing a sustainable transportation system. So the INVEST tool, what is it? It's FHWA's tool, our offering for actually assessing, quantifying, measuring, if you will, evaluating the sustainability of a transportation project. The Federal Highway Administration started creating the INVEST tool back in 2000. Well, the first project that we started was like in 2009. In 2010, we offered a beta version. In 2011, we had a pilot version of the tool. And in 2012, we released version 1.0 of the INVEST tool. INVEST is our acronym for Infrastructure Voluntary Evaluation Sustainability tool. And it's an online web-based tool that allows that was created specifically for state DOTs and MPOs to assess and improve sustainability of their transportation projects, plans, programs, and policies. It's a voluntary web-based tool. It's a free tool. We think it's easy to use. We're trying to make it even easier as we speak. We think there's some practical elements to the tool, and it pretty much consists of 3 groupings of best practices that we call criteria. We use those terms interchangeably often. 3 systems or groupings of practices that relate to transportation planning, transportation, the management and operation of a transportation system, and to transportation projects. And I'll talk a little bit about those in just a little bit. So why did we create the tool? We built the INVEST tool to create something that translates from the broad principles of sustainability into specific actions. And we, again, wanted to give transportation professionals a way to measure sustainability. So it connects those principles with actions. And it doesn't just measure compliance with standards. It measures a level of stewardship and helps transportation organizations go above and beyond what is actually required. It also, we also wanted to have something that would help, that provided a means or a framework for communicating sustainability. How do you talk about it? What is it that you, what are people looking for? What are those things that indicate or that are indicators of sustainability? And so having something like the INVEST tool, a way of describing what those practices are and describing those in terms of quantities, we thought would be very helpful. Just a few more things. It was, again, I mentioned it is voluntary. It's for agencies to use whenever and however they like to use, whenever they want to. It's the data in that we have in the input of data by the user is completely private. We wanted to have something that states and NPOs would be comfortable with using. And so we don't require anyone to use the tool. And anyone who does, or any agency that does use the tool, does so, inputs their own information. It's completely private. We don't even know unless the individual or the agency lets us know that they are actually using the tool. We have some case studies, some implementation sites, but those are sites that we've actually made a concerted effort to go out and seek their application of the tool to help us learn about how well the tool is, or how good the tool is, and what the tool may need in terms of modifications or improvements. I mentioned again that that it's a free tool. There are no limits to how often and how much the tool can be used, and no licensing is required. Again, these are the three different groupings of best practices, criteria that make up the tool. The system planning module consists of criteria that are focused primarily on transportation plans and the transportation planning process. It was designed to allow agencies to measure or assess those activities, how they are actually planning for a transportation system within their state or within a community. The project development criteria in the tool are those that are project specific. Rather than looking at a broad area, a whole state, a whole city, or a whole MPO, those criteria, the criteria within the project development module, focus on a particular transportation project. How is that project sustainable? What can you do within a project to make it more sustainable? Can you use more recycled materials? How are you, what kind of lighting can you use for a particular project? Those are the kinds of things that are included within the project development module. The operations and maintenance module is like the system planning module in that it focuses on a system-wide basis. It's not just about a particular project, but it's what kinds of things is a state or can a state DOT do in order to, as it operates and maintains this entire transportation system. And so we go from the broad to the very specific within all three modules. But within the project development module, so these take us through the entire life cycle of transportation. But even within the project development module, there are certain criteria that apply mostly to the planning process, and some that apply through the design, construction, and operation and maintenance process. This is just a quick screenshot of what the INVEST tool looks like. If you go to and I'll provide the address, of course, a little bit later, but if you go to the INVEST tool, there's a workspace that is, that's there. The screenshot that was shown earlier, I didn't mention, was actually the home page. But users who use the tool have a workspace. You input, can get registered to do scoring, and when a person or an agency decides they want to actually evaluate something, then there's, through the workspace, information is maintained, and you can go back and forth and continue with different evaluations can be saved and worked on simultaneously if you wish. This is just an example of what the criteria look like. This is one of the criteria from the system planning module. SP stands for system planning, and this is the first one in that group. There are, in the system planning module, in all of the modules, excuse me, there is a goal that's stated, a description of how that particular best practice relates to sustainability, and then there are certain kinds of, then there are questions and and scores, depending upon how an individual responds to the questions. Scores are added up, and it's a cumulative kind of effort. And then the scoring is kept by the tool, and then at the end of that, then there's the final score is translated or reflects the level of sustainability for that particular activity. In this case, as an example, the scoring at this point for this project was 79, and so we have different levels of achievement for the scores, kind of your basic, gold, platinum, silver, bronze kind of scoring. So in the system planning module, a score of 96 or more would give a silver rating, over 120 or more for gold, 144 or more for platinum. Okay, so the main thing that we always stress with the INVEST tool is to not focus so much on the scoring, because it's not the number that's really that important. It's what you do with the number. It's what the number means. And so we wanted to encourage states to use the tool to evaluate what they're doing. And one of the things that we've learned about the evaluation process is that it has actually encouraged a lot of discussion, internal discussions within DOTs and among across agencies that sometimes may not have happened unless they were doing something like this, because you can't just have one person. This works best if you have everybody who is involved with that project or that planning process to give some input to the scoring. No one person is necessarily going to be able to answer all of the questions about what a project has done or what's been done on a project within their agency, or they may have different opinions from planners and engineers and environmental folks within their agency that would assist in arriving at a score for any one of the criteria within the tool. And so it encourages that kind of collaboration, which we think is one of the most positive things to come out of creating the tool. The score recognizes what you've done, and it provides a way of recognizing that and sharing that with people. But it's what the score means that's more important. And a lot of times states will be concerned about not scoring well. Nobody wants to score themselves. You're doing your own score, and then at the end of it, you got yourself, pretty, you're saying, well, I thought I was doing better than that, or I thought we were doing much better than that. And maybe you weren't doing as well as you thought, but the point is, now you know what you can do to maybe do things better going forward. And so it's not so much the actual numerical value of the score that we think is the most important thing, is what does that score tell you about your agency? What does that score tell you about your process or your project? What does that score tell you about things you can do in the future that you may not have done in the past that you can do a little bit better? And so we try to encourage people to not be so caught up in what the score itself is, but to be more conscientious about what that score tells you and look at the opportunities that the scoring creates for you. So it creates opportunities, we think, for improvement. You can use the tool to improve your practices, to identify cost-effective measures for improving those practices, and in that way become a more sustainable transportation agency. So this just shows one of, no way I expect anybody to read all of this, but just to point out that when we created the INVEST tool, we realized that we did not create it in a vacuum. That there were other tools that were already in existence. There were some that had some features similar to our tool, and we used input from many of those tools in creating INVEST. But we think that we have some unique aspects of the tool in terms of its being voluntary. It's cutting across the entire life cycle of a transportation project and or system. And so this just kind of shows, a number of the other tools that are out there. And I know that a lot of you in this room and on the webinar have already either used some of these tools or are familiar with them. Green roads, green lights, ILAS, several of them are in existence. And they all have their benefits. They all have their merits. We kind of think ours is best, but you use the tool that's most appropriate for what your needs are. And there's nothing wrong with using more than one tool to kind of see how you're fair. You may improve in one area, that you may find some things from one tool that you may not find in the other. But this is sort of a graphic of where we fit and kind of how we compare to some of those other tools that are out there. So I mentioned we did a pilot of the INVEST tool. We had several states, over 15 states that actually piloted the tool, and we've had several projects. We learned a lot from the INVEST pilots. We had a lot of comments. We used those, provided feedback, created the first version. We released version 1.1, I didn't mention, back in January of this year. We have implementation sites now. We have over 58 projects that have been evaluated with INVEST in over 26 states and something like over 30 agencies, DOTs, MPOs, I think 1 or 2 transit agencies, and others who are using the tool. And we are currently, we have several case studies on on the INVEST website, and we're learning from those implementation sites what they've done with the tool. Many of the ways that people have used the tool we had not even anticipated, and so it's been a good exercise and experience for us. So I'll talk just a little bit, because I know my time is running short, about some of the uses of the INVEST tool. And those, a few of those, point out a few of the case studies, but you can find any and all of these case studies on the website. Ohio DOT is one of our sort of shining examples of the use of the INVEST tool. ODOT used the INVEST tool when it evaluated built a new what's the Cleveland Innerbelt Bridge. They used the INVEST tool to understand how sustainable that project actually was, and their experience was so good that they are actually using that tool to evaluate sustainability of the second span of that bridge, and they incorporated the use of the INVEST tool in the contracting requirements for the bridge, so that the application of INVEST at ODOT provided an incentive, is being used an incentive for bidders to incorporate sustainability and make the cost of construction competitive. So what they did was they actually put into the contract a requirement to score a certain level, use the INVEST tool for scoring. It's a design-build project. So they required in the contract the use of the INVEST tool for achieving sustainability on the new, what they now call the Cleveland Innerbelt Bridge, the George V. Voinovich Bridge. The name has since changed. And what they did was, by doing that, the winning bidder for the contract actually went above the gold level and committed to, and said that we can build a bridge that's more of a platinum level. And so the winning contractor actually gave a firm commitment to do that and bid something like $19 million below the estimate that ODOT had predicted. In Ohio, they built they had a meeting of contractors at the state and others involved within the city, including FHWA, to identify those actions to make the bridge more sustainable. And they're using, and they learned a lot of things that could be done. As an example, they increased the their requirements for, the state's requirements for the use of recycled materials in construction. So then a lot of things were learned by ODOT from their first experience with INVEST that they're using now in their second construction. And what they've done on the contracting side was noted by the Texas Department of Transportation, which is now using a similar approach for the planning and design and construction of a new bridge, the Harbor Bridge in Corpus Christi, a bridge replacement project there. The Illinois Tollway is one of our current implementation sites. It's probably the biggest one that we have. This is a major, something like a $12 billion capital improvement program. And the Illinois Tollway is doing something kind of unique with the INVEST tool, is that they're using it to, they are using all three modules, the system planning, project development, as well as the operations and maintenance module, and they're using that to score or to evaluate a number of different aspects of their projects and plans and programs for the tollway. They've used the project development module to score 35 different projects and using as a baseline. And what they're actually doing is they are scoring projects, new projects, at different levels of completion, something like the 30, the 60, and the 95% level of design and construction. That's a new way of using the tool that we had not thought about. And again, they are learning a lot of things about their projects. They also, and through these implementations, have told us about some things about the tools that can be improved. Keep in mind that as we ask for and support implementation of the tool, we're asking people to not just tell us how good the tool is, but also, is there something wrong with it? What can we do to make it better? And we're finding that sometimes the criteria don't always apply. Not all of the criteria in the tool would necessarily apply to a larger urban area or to a rural area. And so in some states and in some cases, as in the case of the Illinois Tollway, they're asking, they've actually sort of customized the criteria, made changes in the criteria that, because they didn't always fit what their needs were. And they've come to us and said, well, why can't we sort of customize or include our own criteria in some cases? Some of those things that we're learning from the implementation are things that we are using now and incorporating them into future versions of the tool. And so we're learning from the implementation sites just what the tool actually needs. Another quick example, the Arizona DOT, they evaluated over something like 20 construction projects, planned or under construction roundabout projects, and they held INVEST workshops with local governments to look at those projects. And some of the outcomes from that activity was they incorporated into their decision-making process a platform for not just assessing sustainable practices, but how to apply those across the board with those projects. And they have plans there to improve how they manage waste streams from pavement preservation projects and other kinds of activities. They've also made some improvements in their freight mobility. Last one is Utah DOT. UDOT is use the operations and maintenance module. That's the one application that we are really encouraging a wider use of, so that we can learn more about what states can do in terms of improving sustainability of their operations and maintenance practices. But as one of our projects, UDOT learned a lot about, developed a set of recommendations for improving sustainability in its operations and maintenance practices. So those are just a few examples of how states have used the tool. Again, you can get to these case studies on the website. We have on the website the case studies. There's a user toolkit that that is there for any user that you can download exactly from the website. We offer training and some other resources as well. And we are continuing to support research on sustainability. One of the areas that we are actually, we have two main things. A new version of the tool, version 1.1 was released in January. Version 2 we expect to come out this summer. We're working on changes and updates there. And we have some new research products that we'll be releasing soon. One that we are especially excited about, which focuses on what kinds of cost savings potential might there be from applying or using sustainable transportation practices. So I think that's it for me. If you'd like more information about it, I'd be happy to talk to you. I'll be around for a little bit for the rest of the day, but I do appreciate the chance to share with you about the tool, and I encourage you to go to the website, check it out, and learn more about what some of the other states are doing and more details about these that I've covered this morning. So thank you again.
We'll have questions after the employee talk. Okay, and as we're transitioning, I'll introduce our next speaker, who's also going to be talking about sustainability rating systems, but a little bit more broadly. Our next speaker is Gary McVoy. Dr. McVoy holds a PhD in environmental science from Yale University, author of books, papers, chapters, and presentations on a range of sustainability-related topics, including environmental stewardship, computer modeling, expert systems, asset management, maintenance management, and extreme weather adaptation. He's a founding board member for the Ashton Center for Environmental Excellence and an active researcher who has long been an industry thought leader. Now an independent consultant, he worked as Parsons Brinkerhoff's VP for Sustainability and Climate, where he spent 4 years advancing sustainability tools and adaptation strategies. Prior to that, he got his practical education serving the New York State Department of Transportation as its long-standing environmental director, maintenance director, operations director, and retired from State Service as Chief of Operations. So now I'm going to pass it over to Gary to share a little bit more about rating systems.
Thank you, Elise, and thank you for setting this order presentation and Connie's excellent presentation. Make my job much easier, having laid the groundwork for what sustainability is and what we're trying to do here in a cooperative way. And my task this morning is to talk about how these rating systems can be used to advance sustainability within the field of transportation. In order to do that, we need to talk a little bit about what sustainability actually is, and we have to talk a little bit about transportation organizations and how they function. Because the tool has to be appropriate for the context. I can give a CAD machine to my baby granddaughter, but really she learns more from crayons right now. So we need to look at both things. Transportation, sustainability. This becomes a lot easier to conceptualize if you think of it as transportation in support of a more sustainable society. We've got one planet. We'd like to be here for a while longer. We've got the triple bottom line as a way to kind of people, planet, profit, environmental, social, economic, to guide us as far as metrics. And we have transportation organizations which perform a variety of functions. So if we can begin to combine these factors and look over the long term, which has been done in this document, NCHRP Report 750, Volume 4, Sustainability as an Organizing Principle for DOTs, this begins to make some sense, and we can begin to find our way forward and how to use these tools to advance a society's interests. Now, this document looks 50 years out, which sounds pretty imposing, unless you've had a career that runs almost 40 years, in which case it doesn't seem quite so long after all. So, organizational readiness, maturity. How do transportation organizations function? Well, they take money and they convert it into transportation products and services. And they have their means of doing that through their structure involve governance and policy making, decision making, management for the delivery of services. Now these are done in different ways. In the good old days of the interstate era, where we talked about safe mobility, it's pretty simple. Make the letting goals, build the interstate, push whatever in the way out of the way, and move on and get it done. As organizations adopt a more mature approach to this, something that looks more like sustainability in support of a more sustainable society, the focus of the DOT becomes much longer term. In the interstate era, when you're interested in paving things and getting the farmers out of the mud, being ready for the next World War, you have a pretty short-term focus, pretty narrow focus. And as you move up the ladder here in terms of maturity of the system and the thought process and the longer view, it becomes more apparent that we can't focus on highways alone, that it has to be multimodal, and we've got to think in terms of, are we serving society or not with our action? That's really the measure. Now, with that established, this document provides a way for DOTs to gauge themselves on where they are in this journey. It's not the score so much as Connie was talking about. The idea is, in order to get your heads around what it means to be an organization in support of a more sustainable society, you can do a sort of a self-assessment using this tool and see where you are and then talk about it and then move ahead. We bench tested this at the New York State DOT some months ago, and it was found to be very useful. We put together a Survey Monkey questionnaire for DOT staff. That questionnaire still resides out there in cyberspace, should someone want to use it. We actually customized the instrument to what DOT thought, what New York State DOT thought would be a better way to do this, which is to group the topics by topic as opposed to by achievement level. That is, for public participation, don't just have the level 1 and then move on to level 2, level 3 for needs and goals and other things, but to look at things like at a fairly primitive level, you're just trying to do whatever the law requires you to do so that you can get your project built. That's your public outreach approach. Versus at a more mature level, active, real live engagement with stakeholders in a two-way dialogue to actually make decisions. And so it was found that NISDOT, which tends to be kind of at level 3, the green transportation level, they're beginning to bump up against things like their budgets, laws, regulations, public and political expectations as they try to evolve to a higher level, which is natural, and we're talking about a 50-year horizon here. Consequently, they felt that a wider dissemination of this kind of a survey tool would help people understand the value of transportation, help people understand that it's transportation in support of a sustainable society, help understand that transportation is very important to the state's economy, that it's very important to the state's social welfare, that it's very important to the state's environment. And that with that done, they could then begin to have a dialogue with some of their stakeholders in advance. So process and measurement tools. And I thank Connie for her excellent presentation on this. You've saved me about 20 minutes, at least. At the different levels. Remember, we're talking about the levels here from basically level 0, get the interstate built, to level 4, where we're talking about transportation and service to a society. At level 0, we're just trying to get something built, and you're not worried too much about what you're breaking and what's in the way. You don't need sustainability measurement tools. In fact, you don't need any tools at all. Go ahead, draw it on a map, and get it done. That's perhaps an oversimplification, but You get the idea. At level 1, where we're talking about compliant transportation, where you understand that, gee, you know, we used to break things and without much regard for what the impacts were, and we need better tools to figure out how to at least avoid, minimize, and mitigate that. NEPA is your tool. NEPA works great for that. NEPA is a tremendous advance. Very useful in this regard. But we know that transportation affects a lot more things than what we typically call environment. Green transportation, if you will. Environmental sustainability, if you will. It also affects the economy. Try to have an economy without a transportation system. Can't do it. Try to have a healthy society without a transportation system. Can't do it. So these things are also important. So to begin to figure out how we're doing in these regards, we need to have metrics like Joe was talking about. And the metrics need to be specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, timely. So at this green transportation level, we're trying to do more than the minimum the law requires. Trying to do a better job with environment, social, economic impacts. These rating tools are very useful for showing us the way. And Connie went through this morning about the various rating tools, the checklist rating tools, that, as I refer to them. There's also another rating tool, a benefit cost analysis tool, which I'll talk a little bit about later on. And the INVEST tool, Connie explained, it's voluntary web-based. It's a checklist of best practices. It applies to all phases of the project development process. It looks at planning. It looks at project development. It looks at a range of things, recycled materials, earthwork balance, construction training environment. This is a list of best practices, a list of good things to do, and your score is basically your degree of achievement on these things. Same with operations and maintenance. And different scoring templates for different types of projects. I'll come back to this in a few minutes. Green lights is another tool, and the reason I've got it here, other than my fondness for New York State DOT, is that this particular tool is a part of their operation. What we're talking about here is using these tools to change how these organizations function. Every single project in New York State DOT gets evaluated with green lights and gets a score. At the end of the year on Earth Day, all the scores are tallied up. People at the top get recognized, to get their picture taken. Somebody from the governor's office is there. It's all very nice. The people at the bottom, they get a different kind of attention, and this helps keep everybody moving, helping each other to do a better job in service to a more sustainable society. So anyway, this is a programmatic approach that's used on an annual cycle, keyed to Earth Day, so that politically it fits as well. And it's been a big success in my view. The Envision tool is another tool. This represents the professional societies. APWA, ASCE, ACEC have come together. They've invested a tremendous amount of energy and money to develop this tool, which applies to all forms of infrastructure. They have a very well-developed training and certification program in this tool, and it's beginning to catch on throughout various industries. So these checklist systems, they are all best practice driven. They take you well beyond avoidance. It's a great thing. They tend to be process oriented. These are best practices. So if you're doing the best practice, you get credit. Now, you're not talking about how many acres of what you're doing or how many tons of carbon you're saving, but you're talking about whether you're doing these things. It's limited to the number of practices. You can't list 1,000 practices. It's got to be a tractable number. They tend to be one size fits all. You've got one list of best practices, and it applies to basically all projects with some exceptions and changes. They tend to be Excel-based. It's a one-time thing, one project. One project isn't connected to another. They operate all in their own private space. They have some knowledge management, that is some linkages to how to find best practices, but it's pretty static. It's not dynamic. And the taxonomy is variable. One system is different from another. They use different terms, different structures. It's a little confusing. They're very good for broadening thinking, demonstrating credibility, communicating ideas, contrasting alternatives, terrific at ranking projects, rating projects, not so good at ranking them. Big projects rank differently from small projects with the scoring system. Great at stimulating dialogue, and they are pretty good at being smart metrics. The hard metrics we'll get into in a minute. They tend to be a little less adaptable and flexible. Some ideas for how these are evolving now. This context sensitivity, the importance of the particular practice or criteria, the opportunity to apply it. These are things which can be and should be and will be brought into these systems as we go. Quantification of how many acres or how many tons will come. Being able to roll these up programmatically is something that I think needs to be done. I know at least I'm going to be okay. Knowledge management, making the linkages more dynamic. These are all things that can be done. Just some examples here of how the scoring systems could be refined if you included, say, a 0 to 3 scale for the importance of each criteria in its particular application. I mean, if you're talking about habitat in the downtown area, maybe that's not so important. As it would be in a natural resource area. Maybe give one a 3, one a 0. The opportunity for doing good work, maybe the opportunity to do something in the downtown area for habitat is not there. So it would be expensive, it would be harmful, maybe you shouldn't do it. You shouldn't get as many points for doing it there as you would in a place where it makes much more sense. So these systems can be tweaked very easily this way. The slide is too complex for me to go into it at some length now, but I leave it in the record for people to refer to. Similarly, if we simply put these systems into databases, they suddenly become much more powerful. You now have the ability to keep track of how many acres, how many tons, how many meters of whatever you're dealing with here. You also can be linking one project with another so people can begin to help themselves. And the knowledge management potential of these systems in terms of their ability to share information back and forth and with references become greatly expanded. That's a process management tool, these checklist systems. Outcome measurement tools are something that you can use at higher levels of organizational maturity. Now, and you start talking about goals and metrics that are hard. These are heartfelt, animating. They get required. It's not just for fun. And they're not easy to do because you're trying to change the agency's behavior. So, something called sustainable transportation, where you're trying to have the agency behave in a more responsive way to the needs of the future, to the needs of the triple bottom line. Now you're going to use these more sophisticated rating tools which take into account the importance and the opportunity for doing these good things, and to begin to look at the total value of the output of the project or the program. And to do that, we've got to turn to the dismal science. If there's a universal metric, it's got to be money. And at the end of the day, as an operations director, I can tell you most of my time was spent trying to figure out whether I'm going to spend money on A or B. Both worthy. Please help me out. I don't have a clue which way I should go on this. So by rolling up everything into dollars, the economic, the social, the environmental, and comparing that with the costs and the budgets that you've got, you can begin to make some rational decisions. You can at least begin to put down on a sheet of paper why you're going left instead of right, project A, project B. Why are we plowing the snow instead of repaving the highway? Because we're trying to be in more service to a sustainable society as measured through these dollar metrics. This sounds practically impossible, but don't look now, it's already being done. This is basically how the Tiger program works. Because at the end of the day, they've got to decide whether to give money to worthy project A or worthy project B. So they basically ask, okay, so what is it your project's going to produce and what's it going to cost? And it's got to be a common metric because you've got to distinguish one from another. So you look at the Tiger criteria: livability, economic competitiveness, safety, state of good repair, environmental sustainability. Begin to sound familiar? Triple bottom line? Well, they take it, they give you numbers. Here are the numbers for emissions. Here are the costs of emissions, or the benefits if you're reducing them, including carbon. Here are the costs. Here are the benefits of mobility. Improved mobility. Here are the values as measured in dollars. Want to talk about safety? Okay, here's what it costs to have somebody die. At the end of the day, you've got to make a decision on the basis of dollars, so you might as well look at the value in dollars as well, and at least be able to have a conversation about it. So that will stimulate some conversation. These processes are currently bound by benefit cost analysis conventions, where precision, frankly, tends to trump accuracy. In the Tiger program, for example, you will not find a value for habitat. The conversation I keep having with the program people is, you got the wrong value for habitat. And they say, no, we don't. We don't have a value for habitat. I say, oh, yes, you do. Well, show me what it is. Well, it's 0, which I submit is the wrong number. Give me a better number, 12. At least get it on the list. Put down 12. Compare that with the cost of a human life. Begin to have the conversation. That's a healthier way to do it, and I think that will come. As we develop more precedents, which we don't have, the whole process is highly complex and technical. There's limited knowledge management where one project compared with another, and consequently the whole system tends to be unused, suspect, and makes people really uncomfortable. Other than that, it's terrific. So, triple bottom line, valuations, great for broadening thinking, demonstrating credibility, contrasting alternatives, rating, ranking projects, stimulating dialogue, and it is heartfelt. It is animating. It can be required. It is difficult. It will move your organization. It's also almost very adaptable, expandable, and flexible, and that basically you're just you can put anything in it and you can begin to discuss it. So as time goes on, I think that you'll see this system as well starting to be more context sensitive, starting to relate to importance, having a sense of scale. Connie talked a little bit about the savings from various practices. Just getting a sense of scale for, okay, we're plowing the snow. What is the benefit of that? Okay, well, the benefit might be 1% of travel times throughout the state. Well, what's that worth? Well, you can get that number, and it's a big number. 1% improvement in safety. What's that worth in terms of accidents? Well, we can get that number, and it's a big number. So you can begin to get your head around how much you should spend plowing the snow. Knowledge management, link to project examples, linkage to public outreach, something I wanted to touch on. What's the value of a paratransit ride? We can talk about the cost of a paratransit ride, but what's the value? The value to somebody who would otherwise be homebound or institutionalized because they can't get out and get groceries and prescriptions, this is probably very high. What's it worth to society? Well, that's a little harder question, but if people have to be paid, if somebody has to pay for people to be institutionalized where they don't want to be, that's going to cost a lot. So $50 a ride begins to look pretty cheap if we're avoiding these other costs. But we don't think this way until we get to looking at transportation and service to a sustainable society. And a way to get there is to begin to ask our stakeholders and constituents, well, what do you think it's worth? Let's talk about it in terms of wiki dollars or measures of goodness or your personal preference. Put some numbers on a chart. Get some percentages. Get some distribution. Make it hard, heartfelt, animating, required, difficult. So how do we put all this together? Well, at level 4, where we've changed the organization and changed what it's trying to do, We'll be engaging people in benefit cost analysis. And we'll be using publicly vetted values of the triple bottom line. And we'll be using this best practices, which we're constantly developing, thanks to Connie's good work. And these will all broaden thinking, improve communications, increase transparency, facilitate networking, be more consistent with financing questions. This is what it costs, this is what it's worth. Okay, this is becoming a lot clearer. Which, of course, makes it a lot easier in a political context to explain to people why, well, we're closing your bridge so we can save these other ones. And here are the numbers. Would that we have more resources, but these are the decisions we're paid to make. And it's going to be hard. Heartfelt, animating, required, and difficult. Next steps. Let's adopt sustainability as an organizing principle. Talk about transportation and service to a more sustainable society. And after that, the mechanics become much more straightforward. So with that, I thank you for your indulgence.
And so now we have plenty of time for questions, discussion for both Connie and Gary, or if there's, I'm going to cede some discussion to the larger audience, feel free. I think Emily's going to continue to moderate with the webinar, correct?
So make sure we have our microphones on. So go ahead.
Dr. McVoy, thank you. I missed a little bit of it, nature calls, but I got the gist, and I wanted to ask specifically, have you applied the measurement principle to things not normally thought of as transportation, like municipal water systems that deliver 1,000 gallons, 1,000 pounds a day per person to the typical U.S. citizen, and handle it very nicely? And how would it score under those
I think
criteria?
it would be eminently tractable. I think it would score well. I think if you look at places like, I occasionally pass through Washington and Baltimore, and the streets are always torn up because one water main or another broke this afternoon. And if you looked at the cost of disrupting the entire city because one water main broke versus the huge cost of repairing them once and for all so they're not going to break every day, I think you begin to get your head around whether that's a good investment or not.
Well, what I mean is compared to the cost of not even trying to employ such a system, in which case you would drive all the water in and all the waste out, such as what happens when there's an algae bloom in the west of Lake Erie, what was last winter, or when there's a chemical spill, such as in West Virginia, within the past year. And so, because I like to look toward unconventional systems as actually contributing to transportation. And so I'm very interested in these measurement devices.
Yeah, and I think this triple bottom line approach, this evaluation of the triple bottom line approach, is very helpful when you're trying to decide, well, is it transit or is it highways? Is it bridges? Is it pavements? Is it water systems or is it power systems? Is it health systems? Is it education systems? You can begin to relate the two in some sort of common units. If you recall from your high school physics, in order to solve any physics problem, you first got to figure out what are the units. I can't multiply bananas times meters times ounces. It doesn't make any sense. I've got to know if I'm talking about mass or ergs or joules or whatever it is. So get them all on a common metric, except some of the discomfort of having to convert things and with the attendant precision and accuracy problems. But at least you've got all the stuff on the same piece of paper. I mean, no one would sit down here and try to design, say, a kitchen without getting out, an envelope and saying, well, plumbing would cost us this and the countertops are going to cost us that. That's how you approach problems. In order to just figure out what's involved and how they relate and what makes sense in terms of the order of magnitude and scale question. Am I answering questions or?
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Sam Belfield with the HRTPO, the Hampton Roads Transportation Planning Organization. Yes, it is. I was curious, within the Invest tool, if one of the modules incorporated sea level rise and storm surge impacts, and if so, how does it do that?
Well, we do have, and I don't remember the exact number, we do have at least one or two criteria that relate to climate change in the tool.
Okay.
And I can't remember the specific statement of the goal in the tool. But that's one of the things that we are starting to look at, you know, recognizing the significance of that. And but as a whole, can you pull up the list, Gary?
I'm just trying to do that, Connie, yeah.
Thank you.
I think it's probably in planning.
In the plan, the system planning.
Yeah, I saw there was the infrastructure resiliency under
Right,
B.
yeah. That one. So, and whatever the specific goals and measures are, I can't.
Infrastructure resiliency,
Yeah.
16, and that you're expected to, hey, you know, if you're going to build something and spend $1 billion, you probably ought to go make it in, you know, a few years. It's just a good idea.
Yeah.
So it's in there.
It does take that into consideration, you know, it's one of the things that could potentially be done.
And knowing that you should look at that, and then combining that with this valuation tool to say, well, we can't spend an extra $1 billion to make it 1% more resilient, but gee, if an extra 50 cents is going to make the thing twice as resilient for another 100 years, we probably ought to do that. So that enables you to decide at what level to operate. It's helpful in that regard when you begin to combine these two approaches.
All right. Jay, what organizations are doing the best job, in your opinion, of committing these sustainability rating systems to their current workforce, as in formal and in training efforts? I think that's for both of you, maybe?
I like the NISDOT approach, which says we're offering training, but at the end of the day, you got to do it on project. So, in my experience, if you start moving their hands, their hearts and minds will begin to follow. So the idea of using these tools and requiring their use on a systematic basis is the best training you can possibly provide. And then it gets even better if you can encourage them to try and improve the tool as they use it so others have an easier time of it and find it more useful, which is where this kind of database concept is going.
The whole thing about there being so many rating systems out there, and that sort of being a point of concern for potential users of the tool, we recognize at FHWA and don't really have a solution for that or suggestions for making decisions about which tool is the best one to use. It depends on the particular goals and objectives of an individual or an agency. What we offer training on Invest, oftentimes it's customized training. A state DOT will say, we want to know, we like to use your tool, we just don't know what it does or how to use it or what we can potentially do with it. So we offer training and, on-site training for that kind of thing. But in terms of, one of the things that, in terms of needs in the future, And that is maybe trying to help people come to some decision about which of these tools out there might be the one that's more applicable to them. But
Which has to do with where are they in their journey.
exactly.
I mean, if they're still
Exactly.
thinking about making letting goals and trying to pay in sight, let's start with a simple tool.
Is anybody else here a big fan of history? The 1908 report by Albert S. Gallatin, who was the Secretary of the Treasury, he gave that report on roads and canals in North America to the U.S. Senate, 1808, prior to commissioning the canal. And I wondered how much has been given to, prior to the internal combustion engine in the age of steam, our transportation systems were really based on minimizing the work that it took to move things. And since the internal combustion engine, they've been based on exploiting the ease with which we can do work. We do so much work, it's 100 times our metabolism, how much energy we burn in the U.S., every person, 24/7, 15 horsepower is our consumption of fuel. Not shaft output, but fuel content. And how that plays into, future transportation plans.
I think it means that we can't keep doing this forever, and we've got to be more thoughtful about what we're doing and how we're doing it. But we've got to think more broadly. You can't think about just transportation. I mean, we could have no transportation impacts by shutting down the transportation system. We'd all be dead in a year, but, that's the kind of silly conclusion you get to. You have to realize that our urban systems, our metropolitan areas, couldn't exist without good transportation. And that investment in those urban centers is essential because the planet simply can't accommodate the number of people that we have otherwise. So it's got to be a more thoughtful approach to the thing. And I think even in that 1808 report, they were thinking in terms of things like the Erie Canal, which opened up the West and made products from the West be able to come to the urban centers in the East, and you could begin to see how the economy was going to grow. Now, what did it cost to build that? Well, it was a lot at the time. What was the value of it? It was huge. I'm sorry, Connie.
$8 million. Erie Canal was $8 million. And it was paid off before it was completed. It was actually profitable.
New York's always been a leader in this stuff.
There you go. So can I ask one more question? So it came up, and so this isn't from our webinar, that I actually taught a workshop a couple weeks ago, and we talked about a couple of the reviews of rating systems, that compared rating systems, and there's a lot of frustration of, well, if all the numbers are different, which one do we adapt? Is federal highway going to make us use one of these? I mean, New York State is making people use green lights in New York State. I mean, how do you think it's going to, implementation is going to happen when people are sort of overwhelmed with different processes and different numbers? That's a good question, and it's a concern that we've, been facing ever since we started, the venturing into this development of the INVEST tool. We created the tool to try to be helpful. That's really the reason for it, to try to help state DOTs. That was our goal and our incentive. I always preface by answering that question by saying we have no idea what Congress is going to require us to do in the future. So, in absence of a crystal ball, the best way I can answer that question is to say that it was not created or intended to be a requirement of anybody. It was not tied, and is not tied to funding levels that states get or can expect to get or any of that. It's strictly done on a voluntary basis. And the idea was really just to help states address what we saw them facing in their own, facing in terms of figuring out, they were hearing about this thing called sustainability, and the public was starting to say, we want these transportation systems that move goods and services all along, but we want you to do a better job in them to us. We don't want you to destroy the environment while you're doing that. We don't want you. We want you to consider everybody's needs while you're doing that. So the whole idea behind the tool was really just to provide a way of helping the states and MPOs deliver a better transportation system. But and we try to give some incentives for using them. What are those incentives? Well, so we're trying to figure that out. You know, we're thinking about, well, maybe if people are recognized for their work. A lot of times states just want to be recognized for doing a good job. So we're thinking of those kinds of things. But so far we've been saying that you should do it because it's the right thing to do. Well, it is the right thing to do maybe, but that's not enough for some. You know, maybe there's some other ways that people can incentivize the use of invest in other tools like them. But the whole idea is just to make the whole system work better.
So it's not only the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. Brief story. I'm operations director. State needs to reduce budgets to save money. They said, oh, we've cut your snow and ice budget by 10%. I said, oh, okay. Well, if you need me to cut my budget by 10%, why don't you let me figure out how to do it? No, we've cut your snow and ice budget 10%. Just get over it. I said, okay. We put together an analysis which showed the impacts of cutting the snow and ice budget by 10% in terms of how many hours of delay, how much freight wasn't getting delivered, and how many people were going to die. Then sent it through interagency mail, it became foilable, and gee, my 10% came back. But it's the idea that looking at how transportation contributes to the welfare of society, to a more sustainable society in terms of the economy, society, and the environment, you can now begin to have a conversation as to whether or not you should be funding transportation or not. And this is something that transportation agencies are very interested in. And even within their own internal budget processes, they're constantly confounded by things like, should we be putting more money in pavement preservation? Should we be building new capacity? Should we be investing more in transit? Should we be investing more in bridges? Well, this sustainability concept gives them a way to say, okay, well, if we let the pavements go to pieces, we'll have to take a lane and have all this user delay and all this expense, so we better put money into pavements. Oh, wait a minute. If we don't put money into bridges, we'll have to, close the bridges. That's a bigger problem. Let's keep the bridges, and we'll catch up with the pavements later. You begin to have these kind of conversations, and this concept, it can be very powerful in helping them work through this. It's also something that's transportable and that you can show other people, this is my analysis. This is why I'm spending the money here instead of there. Would that I had more, I could do what you wanted as well.
So on that note, it's a great time to pause for lunch, and we'll actually be resuming after lunch at 12:45 and doing a deeper dive into materials, pavement, asset management, stormwater, and climate, which are all areas where we could talk about how do we refine these measures and capture value. So for those who are here in person, lunch will be where breakfast was. For those on the webinar, see you or talk to you at 12:45.
Oh, thank you.
Great speech. I would love it if you would pass judgment on my work. I actually have the prototype right here.
Send it to me.
Oh,
here.
So, I mean, it looks very Frankenstein. There's a lot of work in this. These are ultracapacitors.
Mm-hmm.
They're really key enabling technology. This is simply a little electric vehicle with a 1-horse power motor. It actually only requires about 30 watts.
What's it do?
It goes down this track.
Oh.
And this track is big enough for this, which will be the container bay, and there will be another unit like that.
So it helps to fix pipes?
No. It brings home your groceries, takes away your trash, delivers the mail. Why are we using 4,000-pound cars that could easily haul 1,000 or 2,000 pounds?
Yeah.
For prescriptions.
Yeah.
You like it?
Yeah, I do.
You think it would come out good in your evaluation? I think it's universally applicable.
The cost of building it is going to have to factor into the long value.
And I think it comes to between 50 and 200,000 a mile in the Atlantic coastal plain, depending where you're putting it in. When you get into the granite of New York City and the backfit, you may be talking $4 million a mile.
What if you got
800 people per 800
Yeah. and
residents.
existing conduits, which you might be able to repurpose?
You know, I doubt that that's going to be the most cost-effective way to do it. I've been at it 5 years. I've got 5,000 hours. I'm a reactor operator. I'm a submariner. I've got a computer